The point here is to suggest that the death of kings cleared the way for transformation of caste under colonial rule. Caste was refigured as a distinctly religious system, and the transformation had immense implications for everyday social life. The confinement of caste to the realm of religion enabled colonial procedures of rule through the characterization of India as essentially a place of spiritual harmony and liberation. When the state existed in India, so the argument went, it was despotic and epiphenomenal, extractive but fundamentally irrelevant. British rule could thus be characterized as enlightened when it denied Indian subjects even the minimal rights that constituted the basis for the development of civil society in Europe. Caste itself was seen as a form of colonial civil society in India, which provided an ironic and inferior anthropological analogue for the colonized world. In Europe, and the rise of the new nation-states in the 18th century went hand in hand with the construction of a new form of civil society. Under colonialism, caste was thus made out to be far more pervasive, far more totalizing, and far more uniform than it had ever been before, at the same time that it was defined as a fundamentally religious social order. In fact, however, caste had always been political. It had been shaped in fundamental ways by political struggles and processes. Even so, it was not a designation that exhausted the totality of Indian social forms, let alone describe the essence. What we now take as caste is in fact the precipitate of a history that selected caste as the single and systematic category to name and thereby contain the Indian social order. In pre-colonial India, the units of social identity had been multiple, and their respective relations and trajectories were part of a complex, conjunctural, constantly changing political world. The referents of social identity were not only heterogeneous, they were also determined by context. Temple communities, territorial groups, lineage segments, family. The transformations associated with modernity in India were overdetermined by the colonial situation. On the one hand, what was useful for British rule also became available for the uses of many Indians who were recruited to participate in one way or another in the construction of colonial knowledge. On the other hand, new forms of and claims about knowledge, products as they were in large part of early colonial Orientalism and late colonial state practices, could take root only because colonial interventions actively obliterated the political dynamic of colonial society. Ironically, it was the very permeability and dynamism of Indian society that allowed caste to become modern India's apparition of its traditional being. Under colonial rule, caste, now systematic and systematically disembodied, lived on. In this new form, it was appropriated and reconstructed by colonial power. What Orientalist knowledge did most successfully in the Indian context was to assert the pre-colonial authority of a specifically colonial form of power and representation. Caste had been political all along, but under colonialism was anchored to the service of a colonial interest in maintaining social order, justifying colonial power, and sustaining a very particular form of indirect rule. By indirect rule in this context, I mean the mechanisms that were used both to buttress and to displace colonial authority. In the early years of colonial rule, these mechanisms were organized principally through land systems that were linked to modes of property, agrarian relations, and revenue collections. Zamindars, individual collectors, cultivators, and village communities were invariably constituted, after long debates over Indian history and colonial policy, as the authentic heirs of pre-colonial local authority and as primary agents of revenue collection and local order. This was the period when Charles Cornwallis and Philip Francis took their cues from their physiocrats and argued in the favor of resurrection of local lords as a loyal and newly gentrified elite, indebted to British rule and dedicated to improvement. And so for better and for worse, caste did replace the crown that came before. If the crown was literally emptied of the political dynamic and authority that characterized pre-colonial regimes in India's history, caste entered Athena-like into the places left behind. Recounting the history of caste, in other words, is one way of narrating the social history of colonialism in India. This is a history in which the past itself was colonized, in which the domain of civil society was abandoned to theories about the weight of tradition. In this case, the totality represented by the caste system. Caste became the colonial form of civil society. It justified the denial of political rights to Indian subjects, not citizens, and explained the necessity of colonial rule. As India was anthropologizing the colonial interests, a narrative about its social formation, its political capacity, and its civilizational inheritance began increasingly to tell the story of colonial inevitability and of the permanence of British imperial rule. If caste occupied the place of the social and constrained the possibility of the political, colonial rule could consist largely of the enumerative technology, of the census and the ethnographic survey, producing by the late 19th century what I call the ethnographic state. This is not the whole story, of course, for at the very time that caste was consolidated as the primary object of social classification and knowledge, it was appropriated in other ways as well. And it was also steadily subordinated to the political mobilization around the nationalist movement, which disproved one colonial myth after another. But caste remained and was in fact recast in ways that have caused embarrassment and critique and have provided the basis for new forms of social mobilization and progressive politics. Caste has become uniquely Indian and not always in ways that satisfy either liberal or conservative agendas on national identity. We shall now look at the second part of this, which is missionary views. The first extensive and in the early years of the 19th century the most influential European account of caste united textual formulations with empirical observations. It appeared in the text published under the name of Abbé Dubois in 1816, in a text called Description of the Character, Manners and Customs of the People of India and of their Institutions, Religious and Civil. Dubois began his book by describing the caste system in India, referring to the Varna system as outlined in the Dharma Shastras. He then noted that there were many prejudices against caste and persons who believed that caste is not only useless to the body politic, it is also ridiculous and even calculated to bring trouble and disorder on the people. But he went on to say, for my part, having lived many years on friendly terms with the Hindus, I have been able to study their national life and character closely, and have arrived at a quite opposite decision on this subject of caste. I believe caste division to be in many respects the shadow, the happiest effort of Hindu legislation. I am persuaded that it is simply and solely due to the distribution of the people into castes that India did not lapse into a state of barbarism, and that she preserved and perfected the arts and sciences of civilization, while most other nations of the earth remain in a state of barbarism. His high opinion of caste was linked to his very low opinion of Hindu morality. For Dubois, highest praise was reserved for the ancient Hindu lawgivers or legislators who conceived the caste system and organized it in terms of sufficient sanction and conviction to prevent the possibility of systematic breakdown for millennia to come. So impressed was he that he not only explained the failure of Christianity through caste, he also recommended against substantial interference in Indian affairs on the part of the colonial rulers. It is in the nature of the Hindus to cling to their civil and religious institutions, to their old customs and habits. Let us leave them their cherished laws and prejudices, since no human effort will persuade them to give them up, even in their own interests. And let us not risk making the gentlest and most submissive people in the world furious and indomitable by thwarting them. Let us take care lest we bring about, by some hasty or impudent course of action, catastrophes which would reduce the country to a state of anarchy, desolation, and ultimate ruin. For in my humble opinion, the day when the government attempts to interfere with any of the more important religious and civil usages of the Hindus will be the last of its existence as a political power. Even when they were no longer explicitly engaged with matters of conquest, the British were concerned about land revenue and the growing need to provide regular income from agriculture to supplement the mercantile profits of international trade. This also mitigated a preoccupation with caste in favor of the village. Thomas Munro, Mark Wilkes, and Charles Metcalfe all wrote eloquently about the importance of the village community. Metcalfe's words are perhaps the most quoted. The village communities are like little republics, having nearly everything they can want within themselves and almost independent of any foreign relations. Dynasty after dynasty tumbles down, revolution succeeds to revolution, but the village community remains the same. Thomas Munro, the architect of the Madras Rotwari settlement, which unlike Cornwallis Zamindari settlement in Bengal was made with individual cultivators, wrote in a report from Anandpur on May 15, 1806, that every village with its 12 Ayangadis, as they are called, is a kind of little republic, with a potile at the head of it, and India is a mass of such republics. Colonialism in India produced new forms of society that have been taken to be traditional. Caste itself, as we now know it, is not a residual survival of ancient India, but a specifically colonial form of that is substituted for civil society that both justified and maintained an Orientalist vision. This was a vision of an India in which religion transcended politics, society resisted change, and the state awaited its virgin birth in the late colonial era. Thus, caste has become the modernist apparition of India's traditional self. Under colonial rule, caste now defined by the dharmic idea of varna, disembodied from its former political context, and available as the principal object of colonial knowledge, could take on a new and different form. In this dissociated form, it was appropriated and reconstructed by British rule, and even after decolonization, academic preoccupations have continued to be fascinated with the same chimeric forms that so preoccupied the British, even as they have mistaken the effects of British rule for the traditional predicates of it. What anthropology and Indology together have done most successfully in the post-colonial context has been to assert the pre-colonial authority of a specifically colonial form of power and representation, not only disguising the history of colonialism and the essentially contingent and political character of caste, but also reproducing what might be the most extraordinary legacy of colonial rule in the contemporary social life of caste and Hinduism in India. The state of ethnography, British, French, and American, turns out to be direct descendant of the ethnographic state.